So welcome to the 10-minute tutorial series, a series of, clue is in the title, 10-minute tutorials on the A-Level French Revolution course. Doesn't matter whether you are doing AQA, an Excel or OCR, this is the series of mini tutorials for you. Very important, go to myhistorytutor.com website there. You can get yourself a copy of the A-level textbook that accompanies this series. So what we talk about in the tutorials, we expand in great depth in the book. So make sure you go there. All right, let's get started with the lesson. Okay, so the context then. So just to remind you, the debt situation was terrible, and it was arguably getting worse. Um, this is why the Estates General had to be called, because Louis was unable to force through any new legislation to increase taxes, to pay off the loans that France had incurred in the American War of Independence, which were falling due. And they'd effectively declared themselves bankrupt as a country in the August before this, 1788. They had simply run out of money and they were desperate. They had to find a way through it. So the idea was to call the Estates General, which was a representative body of all of France, to figure out how on earth do we navigate these difficult financial waters. But the problem that Louis had is that pretty much all sections of society, with the possible exception of the clergy, had a real gripe with the king. As we shall see in just a moment, as part of the calling of the Estates General, they issued what was called cahiers. Cahiers were essentially the first national opinion poll. And they were the exact phrase was cahier de dolencias, and that was grievances that everybody in France was entitled to put together and send to the king prior to the Estates General being formed. The idea being that the king and the Estates General would consider these grievances when they sat. It's also important at this time, very important at this time, to understand that there was a willingness to constrain, not kill. That's the phrase I've put down there. Okay, so constrain the monarchy, not kill the monarchy, i.e., not end the monarchy. There was very little support for the idea of a republic. So even amongst people like Maximilien Robespierre, who became an ardent abolitionist, a supporter of the revolution in an extreme form, i.e., ending the monarchy. Even people like that in 1789 were not in favour of abolishing the monarchy. They thought it would just be too big an event to happen and could cause just too many problems in France. They didn't want it to trigger a civil war. Now the background here is the Estates General had not been called for 175 years. So why is that significant? Really because it's an admission of failure on Louis's part. I mean, if something hasn't been called for 175 years, what that basically says is, if we're calling it now in 1789, obviously the situation is so desperate we have no other choice. It hadn't been called since 1614. So that was telling the people of France that in that time period in between they didn't really need it because the king was in charge and he was able to navigate the day-to-day business of state. But by calling the Estates General, Louis immediately begins to undermine his position, effectively saying to the people, I've kind of lost control. I can't figure out how to solve this problem. The final bit of context that you need to know is that um, Louis really was quite an unlucky king. As Napoleon once said, "Don't get me a good general, get me a lucky general." Uh, and unfortunately for Louis, Louis was a bit of an unlucky king. There were a succession of bad harvests in the 19s, in the 1770s. But there was a particularly bad harvest in 1788, and there was a particularly harsh winter in 1789. So, as a result of the poor harvest and the terrible winter, you had people that were freezing cold, but freezing cold and hungry. Not a great situation to have if you're a king. At this time, many of the poorest people were spending perhaps 90% of their income on bread. Bread was the staple diet for the poorest in the community. They really couldn't afford any of the luxuries like meat or fish or even fruit very often. It was really bread that they lived on. So if the price of bread went rocketing up, which it would do in times of bad harvest, they were spending up to 90% of their income on bread. Well, what does this mean? Well, as a sort of wider point, what it means is not only were they extremely disgruntled, but because they didn't have much money left over, they couldn't spend very much on other things. So they couldn't buy clothes, for example. So therefore, the textile industry, which was actually France's biggest industry, the textile industry suffered greatly. So you had unemployment rising, which was triggered by the downturn in the economy, and you had a lot of people that were very poor and very hungry and very cold. In essence, you had a melting pot of anger and tension ready to explode. Now, I just want to look at this guy here. So if I just bring it back, we need to just talk about Emmanuel Sieyes. He was known as Abbe Sieyes. Abbe is the French word for somebody who is a low-level clergyman. So he was a member of the Catholic Church, an ordained minister, but he didn't really practice. But he was what's called an abbe, which is a low-level clergyman. Now, Sieyes writes a pamphlet. He writes it at the end of 1788. It gets published right at the beginning of 1789, several months before the Estates General appears. The Estates General appears in May 1789, but he publishes this pamphlet in January 1789. Now, Sieyes was different to many of the senior nobility, the cardinals and the bishops. He wasn't particularly wealthy, and like many of his sort of peers who were lower level clergy, he had a bit of a gripe with the clergy and with the nobility in general. Because he thought, particularly the clergy, he thought that they weren't really contributing a great deal, and he had the same impression of the nobility as well. So he writes a pamphlet, and it's called "What is the Third Estate?" Okay, and in this pamphlet, he basically identifies the nation as the third estate. Okay, so if you look at this quotation taken from it, I'll just read through it very briefly. So it suffices to have made the point that so-called usefulness of a privileged order to the public service is a fallacy. Okay, so just I stop there. What he's basically saying here, the privileged order is obviously the nobility. So what he's basically saying is it's a nonsense. They actually contribute nothing at all. So if I go on, and without help from this order, all the arduous tasks in the service are performed by the third estate. Now, it's pretty obvious what he's saying here, that basically all the stuff that goes together to make a country, the people that farm the land, the people that work in the early factories that they had, the people that build the roads, the people that make the clothes. These are members of the third estate, the ordinary people. These are the people that actually produce the wealth of the economy. So it's almost like a kind of Marxist analysis here, basically saying, look, the people who really are the important people are the ordinary people, and yet they don't get the reward for all their efforts. All their efforts, go to the rich capitalists who own the factories, um, or the landowners who own the land. So if we go on to this next sentence, that without this order, the higher posts could be infinitely better filled, that they ought to be the natural prize and reward of recognized ability and service. So not only is he saying basically the nobility are useless, they don't do anything and they don't contribute anything to society, he's also going on to build on the ideas of some of the Enlightenment thinkers and saying, look, it's completely stupid to give people the senior positions in society just because of an accident of birth or because they buy it. It should be based on ability. So he's directly attacking the whole concept of the ancien regime and venality of offices. And in essence, the summary of his pamphlet, What is the Third Estate, is an argument that sovereignty, so sovereignty is the right to rule, should lie with the third estate. Obviously, this is a complete revolution in thinking because the natural order of society in the ancien regime is that the elite had a natural right to rule. The aristocracy, the nobility, regarded themselves as superior people, and they were put on this earth to be the natural leaders of the country. And of course, at the top of those was the king. Sieyes says this is utter rubbish. Okay, it should be the other way around. Okay, society, the balance of power should revolve, and sovereignty should lie with the people. It was very, very widely read, and as we shall see in a minute, it had huge implications for what happened with the Estates General almost immediately it was formed.
Right, well, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed that. As ever, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and generally get very excited by the video. As ever, don't forget, make sure you go to www.myhistorytutor.com. Get yourself a copy of the book which accompanies the series. It is very, very good and will maximize your chances of getting the top grade. And for the next lesson, we're going to really do a deep dive into the first few months of the Estates General and where it begins to go wrong for Louis.